Hi guys. So as promised, a small video summary slash presentation of my thesis uh, in order to save you to do a lot of reading and hoping that in this way I can explain my thesis a little bit more clearly. I'll only go through the introduction and objective of my research just so you can get a good idea of what it is actually that I'm trying to do, in the hope that with that you're better able to understand my method. So, to kick things off, I would like to quickly introduce myself. For my bachelor, I studied future planet studies, which is an interdisciplinary study where I majored in the earth sciences. And now I'm studying both MOM and MFN, both with a focus on ecology. This is because I'm fascinated by the interaction between abiotic and biotic systems on the largest scales possible, which plays an important role in how and why I'm asking these questions. Questions that should not only interest other human ecologists, but all ecologists, because our man made systems are now at such a scale that they have global effects. So, when I hear the word Eden, as in the quantification of Eden, I envision a lush, scenic landscape teeming with life, um, which is portrayed here on the left by a famous Dutch painter called Jeronimus Bosch. But to put this term into a more scientific context, I'm interested in how the environment dictates where human life can flourish. What is our human ecological niche, and how much of our future Earth will facilitate these specific environmental conditions? So, first, I posed a question where people are expected to live in the future. Now, here it says 2050, which was the initial timeline, but by now I've adjusted it to 2070. And this question, where people are expected to live, is mainly aimed at identifying the current state of our knowledge on future human population distribution projections. Now, the second question, where should people live in the future in 2070, um, is an interesting one because it seems really similar. But humans have proven again and again that they are inherently bad at making choices that lie in the far future, especially if the consequences of these choices will not be apparent for a long time. So, where people are expected to live in the future and where people should live in the future might seem similar, but are in fact very different things. So, then the final question is, what happens if these two agree? What happens when the expected human population distribution does not match the expected distribution of areas that are particularly favorable for human life? Um, well, where are people expected to live? Because the future of our planet does not solely rely on environmental processes, the concept of the shared socio-economic pathways, or the SSPs, was developed by the scientific community, um, which are scenarios that try to capture the variance in future environmental and mostly social responses that can be expected as a response to climate change. The x-axis in this figure qualitatively describes how hard it is to overcome adaptation challenges, while the y-axis describes how hard it is to overcome mitigation challenges. SSP1, for instance, is the most optimistic outcome possible, which represents a scenario with a steady, gradual change towards a more sustainable future. A world that values inclusivity of all people while respecting its environmental thresholds. Thus, it represents a low challenge towards both adaptive and mitigative measurements. Whereas the SSP3 scenario is the direct opposite. It entails a world with resurgent nationalism, where countries increasingly focus on domestic issues for slow economic development and rising inequality. or more broadly speaking, the world has a hard time both adapting to and mitigating climate change. So, in total, five different scenarios have been constructed, and all represent possible alternative futures, where each scenario has both a qualitatively logically linked narrative and a quantitative data set describing population, urbanization, and GDP. Which brings us a step closer to the question where people are expected to live in 2070. Here we see a map by Jones and O'Neill, where they have taken the data from the SSP scenarios and created a spatially explicit dataset of population density. They did not only do this for the SSP1 scenario, but they made a spatial projection for population count, density, urbanization for all five scenarios. And it is this data that in my research I will define as the expected population distribution. So now that we have established where people are expected to live, we move on to the next question. Where should people live? A question which can be answered from many different perspectives. As a natural scientist, I lean towards mostly using environmental factors, a perspective that largely stems from my scientific background. However, I dare to argue that this bias does not take away from my final results. Although humans have shown that with the use of technology, they can, albeit temporarily, occupy even the most inhospitable of places. Just think about people who are in the ISS or on the Scott Amundsen research base. It could certainly be argued that all life, including human life, does have an ecological niche. So the graph here is a very, very simplified illustration of that concept, showing an interaction between an environmental factor X and the amount of population present. Um, so when making that concept a bit more tangible, we see here a map produced by Shu et al., where they show a map depicting the human temperature niche, where dark areas represent areas that are more suitable for human life, and light areas are less suitable for human life. Um, Now we see the same map, but 50 years into the future. Now the spatial pattern of the niche seems to have shifted away from the equators, leaving 1 to 3 billion people outside of their preferred temperature niche, which would, so what would such a shift mean for the distribution of people in the future? Will they adapt or migrate? And what would that shift in human systems mean for all the natural systems that are intertwined with them? But temperature is not the only factor that comes into play. There are several other researchers that have found other factors that have a significant influence on human settlement and or migration. Presented here are some of the factors that I've considered within my research, which include temperature, distance, sea level rise, and various social factors. Um, in my methods, you'll see exactly what factors I used and what factors I didn't use. Um, and then the big question is, what if the expected population following the SSP scenario does not match the projection of people based on where they should live? What does that mean for us, for the planet, and eventually for all the natural systems that support our human systems? Um, yeah, so what are the implications for our productive and natural systems that are key in maintaining our cities of the future? The future of natural and urban systems are intertwined, but they both depend on the environmental conditions of the future. So, in my research, I try to project, anticipate, and plan for changing future conditions. Uh, yeah, and that leads me to the following research questions. Where are the discrepancies between projected global human population according to the SSP1 scenario, a social model, and an environmental model? And I limit my study to the RCP 2.6 scenario. So for the social model, I'll be using the Jones and O'Neill model. Then the environmental models, at first I was only going to compare the Jones model to my own model, but I had some issues with making my own model. So as a backup, I made a comparison with the Jones model and the Shu model, which is an environmental model of human population distribution. But in the end, my model did end up working, so now I'm comparing all three with each other. So yeah, what I said before, it will be uh, the Jones model, the social model, the spatial model, which I'll be making or have already made, and then the Shu model, with my null hypothesis being that the fraction of people um, living in the environmental optimum does not change. Or in other words, I expect that the the population, my null hypothesis expects that the population of all these three will be the same if it doesn't, if these environmental factors do not influence uh, future human population distribution. Um, so to make it a bit more tangible, the results I actually expect is one of three. Either the social model predicts in a certain area, the social model predicts less people than the environmental model, which means that the environment is able to sustain more people. They are equal, the social model and environmental model, which means that exactly the optimal amount of people from both an environmental and social perspective are living in a certain area. And then a third alternative where the social model predicts there are more people living there than the environmental model predicts, which implies that um, the environment, the area, um, the amount of people living there is unsustainable. Eventually, something will go wrong, and the area will very likely be even will be able to support even less people. So I hope this made it a bit more clear. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to ask them to me. I could always send my full thesis with introduction, everything all written out, but I hope doing it this way makes it uh, a bit easier.